Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be able to talk about research that I've worked on with a group of researchers across urban planning, urban engineering, transportation engineering, design, as well as market research here at the University of Virginia. And specifically, what I'd like to talk about is how attention, the way we look at the world around us, as well as heart rate and our preferences, might vary on a street that is either open or closed to vehicles. So this study is really, again, focusing on this idea that streets can be closed to cars. And that has become an increasingly popular approach to trying to change our built environment, to trying to change the experience of cities. Especially during COVID-19, but really before and after, the idea that by restricting cars from streets, we can create environments that are geared around pedestrians, maybe cyclists as well. But fundamentally, what the impacts of those environments are remains understudied. Urban street conditions are something that really are disciplinarily shared. So planners, we care about how we set the terms for rearranging environments, street environments, but that's a matter of urban design. That's a matter of engineering as well, and transportation planning. I think in addition, because these are often mixed use streets, it's not just about the pedestrian experience, but also economic activity. Where are people going to go and shop? So because for all of these reasons, this is an important area that deserves additional attention. Now, in order to understand this, we are trying to start at the beginning with the physiological response to a street environment. And we're using mobile eye tracking as well as some other physiological measures like heart rate measurement to understand how attention varies and what the implication is of changes in attention. And fundamentally, what we ask in this study, or at least what we ask and begin to answer, is are changes in attention associated with other physiological and cognitive processes? So if we pay attention to different parts of the environment, does that change our stress level? Does that change how we respond to the environment? Does it change what we think about that environment and ultimately our likelihood of returning to it? So in order to do that, not just mobile eye tracking, but like I said, heart rate variability, as well as a survey of stated preferences. Those are all parts of this study. So in the literature, there's already a limited but growing literature on how attention is paid while pedestrians are walking around, using mobile eye tracking specifically. This idea that, if I haven't defined it yet, that wearing fundamentally eyeglasses that can track what you're looking at, basically with sensors that see where the eye is moving and what it focuses on, that there is some information on what people look at. We do know that pedestrian attention is targeted instrumentally because people need information to help move around safely and to find what they need, find where they want to go. Buildings, intriguingly, are not necessarily associated with route finding. So for the most part, people don't use the street wall to actually find where they're going. And so how people interact with beyond the sidewalk, with buildings, with trees, with other elements is less well understood. But we do know that pedestrianized streets in general, this is again from the literature, allow attention, this what we fixate on when we are moving through a street, pedestrianized streets allow attention to be more broadly distributed. So not quite so focused just on traffic. From the heart rate literature on heart rate and walking, we do know that heart rate variability, changes in heart rate, spikes in heart rate are associated with stress. And so that's perhaps no surprise, but that's an important part of the literature. And that, again, no surprise, difficult walking environments, maybe stressful walking environments, are going to be more associated with changes in heart rate, spikes in heart rate. So that's something that we're looking for in the environment as well. In order to do this, we really wanted to start with a typology, kind of a way of thinking about what are the elements of a street that somebody might pay attention to. And of course, what are the elements that that somebody might pay attention to, whether a street is open to cars or closed to cars? So not surprisingly, transportation occupies a significant portion of people's attention, or it could. Signs and signals, yes, but also vehicles and traffic, as well as parking, are cars parked or not? Built structures, the storefronts, the street wall and facades, the signage along built structures. How do people pay attention to that? Nature, certainly. On the street, there can be, even an urban street, there are trees, there are plants, and of course, one can look up at the sky as well. And then finally, even if this is not a quote unquote fixed dimension of a built environment, much like a car, people. So other people walking, or patrons of stores, whether they're sitting outside or inside, all of those are things that somebody might pay attention to on a street, whether it is open or closed to cars. And so we utilize this in the research, as I'll show you in a few slides. So where we did this research is on a street called Beverly Street, which is the main street in Stanton, Virginia. And that word, Stanton, is pronounced with that ah sound in Virginia. So not like you might think it's pronounced, but that's how we pronounce it in Virginia. And the thing about Beverly Street is that it is open to cars for most of the week and during winter times. But for the spring, summer, and fall, on the weekends, it's closed. And businesses are able to open up tables. People are able to walk up and down without restrictions, except at cross streets, which the cross streets remain open. And so what that allows us to do is to approach a kind of experiment, maybe a quasi-experiment, where we can look at differences in attention when the street's open to cars, as well as when it's closed to cars. So the way we did this is that we asked people, we invited participants to walk up and down the street. They completed a pre-survey and a post-survey, but in the intervening time, they walked up 4 blocks and then down 4 blocks on the street on 2 different days, one day when it was open to cars and one day when it was closed to cars, wearing the mobile eye tracking glasses, as well as the heart rate monitoring wristwatch as well. And these are the kind of the technological and methodological aspects of our study. In terms of collecting eye tracking data, we used Tobii Pro glasses, the Tobii Pro 3, which allowed us to look at gaze focus or fixations. And we used a threshold that's recommended in the literature for analyzing fixations. Although we might talk about this more, there's not necessarily clear literature about what the appropriate amount of time one needs to have to qualify something as a fixation in the urban environment. But we used kind of recommended levels based on prior research. We also recorded video using the Tobii Pro 3 glasses, which not only tracks people's eyes, but tracks what they're looking at out in the environment. And that allowed us to identify the different built environment elements according to our typology, so that we could match attention to different aspects of the built environment. We collected physiological data with a smartwatch. That's the heart rate change points that we looked at, basically looking at when heart rate spiked. And then finally, we did the survey, pre and post surveys, that allowed us to look at preferences for the open and closed streets, as well as other aspects, demographic data and other important questions as well. Now, the important thing is our survey ultimately our study included 12 people. This is a pilot study. This is a set of different methods that we have combined together in order to understand this phenomenon. And we're able to analyze patterns, but we're not necessarily able, because of the sample size, to statistically analyze those results. But we can look at it descriptively and look at differences in the open and closed street with our 12 participants. Okay, and here are the results. First, focusing on eye tracking. And so what we see in the stacked bars is the primary result. when you average our 12 participants and what they focused on, and you can see here, moving vehicles, parked vehicles, patrons, pedestrians, storefronts, and so on, what they focused on when the street was open to vehicles was to a great degree storefronts, as well as the sidewalk. You have to look at the sidewalk to see where you're going. And then, of course, moving and parked vehicles. When the street was closed to vehicles, what we found very interesting is that people certainly weren't paying attention to parked vehicles because they were gone, and much less to moving vehicles because, again, they could look at them on cross streets, but there were fewer opportunities. But they actually also reduced their attention to a significant amount, or to a substantial amount, in looking at storefronts as well, because instead they looked to a great degree at pedestrians and business patrons. That appeared as in a significant way only when the street was closed to vehicles. So, are there multiple kind of causal reasons for this? The one most notably being that when the street is closed, then that is also a time when the city, designates for people to come downtown, sit outside, eat, walk around. Yes, so the reason why there's more fixation on patrons and pedestrians is in part because they're there when they aren't there in as much in as high of a level when the street is open to cars. However, the fact that they actually reduced focus, that our pedestrians reduced their focus on other aspects of the built environment, excluded them to focus on patrons and pedestrians even more, is an interesting finding to show how important the social dimension of the street is when it's closed to cars. And this just shows that this is looking at each participant individually. And really what this is showing is that the trends are very consistent, even though there's variation from person to person. This is 12 sets of comparisons between the open street and the closed street. What we see is that the increased fixation on patrons and pedestrians is quite consistent. In fact, it's unilaterally consistent, as are the other patterns as well. So what's interesting about the survey results in comparison to our findings that people focus on pedestrians when they're there, is that people had much more positive opinions across the board regarding the street, even in aspects of the street that they weren't necessarily paying more attention to. So take, for example, question 5, how aware were you of businesses? Even though people actually paid less attention in a empirically measurable way when the street was when the street was closed to cars and therefore open to pedestrians, they actually still felt that they were more aware of the businesses when the street was closed to cars, which is interesting, right? They're paying more attention to humans, but they still feel like it's more open to businesses. They felt more interested, again, in question 4 of feeling compelled to visit a business. And they also felt more positive about the street in terms of a place for recreation. They felt safer. They felt safe navigating and crossing the street. And then they also felt more engaged in the life of the street. And they felt that the street overall was more attractive. And this is, again, even though they're not necessarily paying more attention to the street wall, to trees and things like that, but they felt in many ways that their preference was for the closed streets. And so we find this pretty interesting. The idea that attention, even though there are significant differences and people pay attention to something very different, namely people, when the street is closed, it has this kind of expanding effect, not just on relation to people, and is this a social environment, which, again, question 6, of course, people felt more socially involved. They really are looking at people. But beyond that, everything else is better as well. And we found this to be kind of interesting and sets up an interesting longer term research question around how distributions in attention actually feed into changing preferences and behavior. Now, heart rate change points, I also want to treat that and talk about what we found. I will say, to start this off, you can see here we had far more samples of when people's heart rate spiked in when the street was open to cars than when it was closed to cars. And part of that, unfortunately, were some lost data during when the street was closed to cars. So because of that, I want to just talk broadly about what these results are and not try to go into too much detail. Fundamentally, what we found is that most of the spikes were when people were looking down at the ground and the sidewalk. In other words, people's stress levels went up when they were navigating or trying to cross the street or do something like that. So that is an important fact in and of itself. But also what we found was in terms of the location of where people's heart rate spiked, they were far more likely to spike at intersection locations compared to the actual amount of time people spent in intersection locations. So let me put that a different way. We found that 47.6% of heart rate spikes, or about 50%, occurred in intersection locations, despite the fact that only 17% of their time was actually spent in intersection locations. Their time and space was spent in intersection locations. So what that means is that people are much more likely to be stressed out when they're crossing the street. And that just reinforces other findings from the literature. Now, to summarize, what are the main findings that really came out of this study? One is that when the street was closed to cars, participants allocated much more visual attention to people and less to cars, as well as, frankly, to storefronts and nature, which, again, we found very interesting. The survey responses also revealed that people perceive many factors, not just the social dimension of the street, but the businesses and other aspects of the street as more appealing when the street was closed to cars. And then finally, as I just reported, disproportionately, there were a disproportionately high number of heart rate spikes in the locations where people were crossing the street rather than just walking down mid-block. So coming to the conclusion, I think it's important to emphasize the limitations of the study, and we have a small survey size of 12 adults. So statistical inference was not possible. We were able to just look at this again descriptively. Also important, although we frame this as an experiment, a natural experiment of a sort, where we look at how people pay attention to a single street in two different conditions, it is also true that there are other factors at play here. The time of week is different when the streets are open and closed. The street is open on weekdays and closed on weekends. The weather varied from day to day. The opportunities that businesses put out in the street are different, of course, when the street is open and closed. And so because of that, we're not really just looking at a perfect control, but we're looking at really two different environments where the only thing that we're really able to hold constant is the built environment of trees and street wall itself. So, that's important to keep in mind. Now, for future research, I mentioned this before, we're really interested. There's a lot of literature on mobile eye tracking and fixation, but not so much yet that really dives into the details in urban environments, out in the wild, so to speak, in the real world. And we think there's more work to be done on this. More conceptually, we're very interested in connecting the attention that we looked at, so how people pay attention to the world around them, with their perception of what's positive and negative. So again, it's like people are saying everything is better, but what is the connection? How does it that being able to pay attention to people leads to this general positive perception? And there are a lot of great urban design, urban planning, and psychological theories around this. So we're interested in those connections and testing those connections. And then looking at how over the long run, this affects people's behavior. How do we get people to want to get out of their cars and want to spend more time in pedestrianized streets and feel good about it? So those are some of the conceptual connections we want to make through further research. And of course, there are other long-term implications to this research that we're interested in. One of the major ones that we're interested in is the effect of technology on these relations. So if people are focused on their phones, what does that do to the way we pay attention to the urban street? And that is still, there's still only a limited amount of research on this. And then finally, our ultimate goal for application is around best practices. So for planners, engineers, and designers who are seeking to implement street repurposing, closing streets, making them more pedestrian oriented, it's important for us to be able to communicate, well, what are the impacts? What are the benefits of it? And also, what are the likely impacts? How can we make these things best for people? How can we make them feel good about these pedestrianized streets? And we think that this kind of research can lead to best practices that are really grounded in empirical findings. So that is the study. This is what we've been looking at, and I want to acknowledge certainly the study participants in the city of Stanton who supported us in doing this research, as well as the tourism board, and fundamentally our funding and support from Oracle Labs at the University of Virginia and the Three Cavaliers Fund. Thank you so much.